I'm very happy to address you, the young participants, to the Assembly of the World Council of Churches. I've been asked to introduce to you a series of ideas, concepts about migration. A migrant is anyone who establishes himself or herself outside his or her home. That's the general definition of the migrant. So you need some kind of establishment. It's not the tourist, for example. And then you have domestic migrants or internal migrants, and then you have international migrants. International migrants cross an international border. Domestic migrants stay inside their country of origin. Migrants can be divided into many categories. And immigrants, especially in immigration countries like Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, means someone who comes to establish himself or herself sort of permanently. This has changed. Nowadays people move a lot more. Mobility is a feature of modern life. So you have immigrants, but you also have all sorts of other migrants. Students migrate to do their studies for a few years and then find a job somewhere else or back home, depending. Expats are sent by their companies or their governments to live somewhere else for a number of years. Migrant workers will take up contracts in different countries, and they're often called temporary migrant workers. And the temporariness of their stay in the country can extend from a few weeks to a few months to a few years. And then you have irregular migrants who cross the border without the proper documentation and find work, often establish themselves, often live quite a long time without being known to the authorities, but who work, who have an employer, who have a job, who receive a salary. Their work conditions are often not good. Irregular migrants are very vulnerable to exploitation. So there are also migrants. It is estimated at this point that there are approximately 215 million migrants in the world. Two other categories of migrants are interesting and are much talked about in the media. Refugees. Refugees are people who fear persecution in their own country and have to flee their country and find refuge somewhere else. People who arrive in the country and ask for refugee status are often called asylum seekers. These people may or may not be refugees. We don't know yet. We have to do the refugee determination procedure to find out. And in the meantime, states will recognize them or not a series of entitlement or social protections. Right to work, right to access healthcare, right to school, etc., etc. And this is much debated in many countries. Another group of interesting persons are internally displaced persons. We go back to domestic migrants, internal migrants. And these people, the IDPs, internally displaced persons, are persons who are forced to flee the place where they live and flee to somewhere else, but do not cross an international border. They remain in their country of origin. And all these people are migrants. And what is interesting is that most of us are either migrants or descendants of migrants. We often have a migration history within 2 generations in our family. What are the general trends that we observe in relation to migration? The first thing or myth we have to dispel is that migrants come from the south and go to the north. 60% of migration is south-south. Only 40% comes from the south and goes to the north. And there's a small part that is north-north as well. So it's not a matter of going from developing world to developed world. It's much more, at the same time, simple and complicated. It's going from a place where you have difficulty organizing a life for yourself and your family to a place where you can find a job and some kind of security. And that might be the country next door. Another trend which is very important is the fact that the global north has implemented over the past 2 decades, almost 3 decades now, very strict border control policies and has progressively tried to seal its borders, the borders of the global north, to southern migration. This has come in different stages, and certainly the events of 9/11 have pushed the whole issue of international migration into the international security agenda. And we see fences and walls being built between the US and Mexico, between India and Bangladesh. In different places of the world, you see these fences and walls, these mechanisms to prevent migrants from crossing international borders. Migration is not an easy journey, and for those who are vulnerable, the risks are even higher. And we now have in many countries of the global north temporary migrant worker programs, which are problematic because, as the word temporary says, they're supposed to stay for only a short time. And they're supposed to answer only temporary labor needs. But very often this is not what happens. What happens is that these are permanent labor needs, but employers don't want to pay the wages that the local labor market would command, and they prefer to have vulnerable migrant workers who will accept lower wages and more difficult, dangerous, and dirty working conditions. With the securitization of migration comes another trend which is very important, which is the criminalization of irregular migration. Irregular migrants have been portrayed as criminals, and so they're portrayed as criminals. They have been detained for months, years sometimes. They are being presented in the press, in the media, as dangerous. They're often scapegoated. They are accused of all sorts of social ills, from unemployment to epidemics to criminality, which social research shows is simply not true. But since they're vulnerable and since they're not represented in any way in the political system, people can say whatever they wish. There's no way we can create a counter-discourse to meaningfully convince public opinion that they're not dangerous, that they're working for us, that they are actually filling important economic needs in our economies. We should dispel the myth that migration is an anomaly, that migration is something that would not exist in a perfect world, that if people were happy, they would not migrate. Mankind, humankind, has always migrated. Migration is the normal state of mankind. Settlement is the, tiny exception in the history of mankind. We've migrated through the planet. In recent years, the economy has often dictated the migration movements. When you had economic downturns or crisis, where unemployment, for example, would rise highly in some countries, we would see migration from those countries into neighboring countries where employment was more readily available. Migration is encouraged within countries in order to meet economic needs. It's not different because there's an international border somewhere. People move in order to fulfill needs. In the end, most migration happens because we want to be able to exercise options to create a future for ourselves and our children. Migration is a difficult journey. Many migrants face hardship. What migrants don't always realize for themselves, they often realize it for their children. Very often, you will see in many countries of the world, you will see people who say, well, I haven't achieved what I wanted to do, but at least my children are going to school, one of them is going to university, and I'm happy. They will have a good life. This is, in essence, what dignity is all about. Exercising options for oneself. Deciding for oneself what we want to do in life. Not letting events or others dictate what's going to happen to us. And this is in this way that migration is actually a dignity-seeking movement. Another very important element that we have to think about is that migration is often portrayed as a mass. Mostly, migration is an individual decision because we're all individuals. There are collective aspects to migration, and we often see that when people are quite desperate about the situation they're in, they will try to identify who in their group is resourceful enough to actually go abroad and try to find a place for himself or herself and create hope for everyone. And we must not forget that the dignity of that individual means not to be treated as simply a part of a mass. The other, in quotation marks, has always been a threat for all the groups. If we read the oldest texts that we have, we find that the relationship to the other, to the foreigner, to the person in the next country or the next city, can be a friend but can be a foe. And this other, the construction of this other, has always been something very important in the political life and the social life of groups. And we have seen also that the great religions of this planet have often promoted the law of hospitality, which, for example, in the Bible says, welcome the foreigner because you were yourself a foreigner, or welcome the foreigner as you would like the foreigner to welcome you. This idea is in many religions because it is a common human experience. Now, migrants are today often portrayed by politicians and in the media as problematic. And this portrayal is pervasive and is difficult to contradict. The reason is that migrants do not vote, cannot be elected in their host country. Therefore, they do not count. Politically, they're absent. And those who take the floor most often regarding migration policies are those who oppose migrants. NGOs, churches, lawyers, many people are doing great work with the migrants. But in many cases, we don't see political parties taking up the cause of protecting migrants' rights, of protecting the rights of irregular migrants, of protecting the rights of vulnerable temporary migrant workers. We don't see that because if they do it, they will lose votes. Moreover, very often, migrants who are either in an irregular situation or vulnerable fear that they might be identified, arrested, detained, deported, because they are in a precarious legal status. And so this vulnerability means that migrants don't complain. They don't complain because they fear that if they stick their neck out, they might be identified and deported. Migrants therefore face discrimination, exclusion, marginalization, often verbal violence, and sometimes even physical violence. Migrants die almost every day from attacks in different parts of the world. And very often, the authors of the attacks are not apprehended, prosecuted, punished. Migration has a great impact on individuals and on societies. It has an impact on the countries of origin, for example. Very often, these migrants will send back home remittances, money, to their family, to help their brothers and sisters go to school, to help build another room to the house, to help fund the building of a well in the village. So these remittances actually serve a purpose and fund many elements of development in the countries of origin. Migrants also sometimes, not always, but sometimes, come home after a while. Come home with new skills, new languages, with professional experience, with an expertise, and put that to good use in the country of origin, in the village or in the city. And so migration can, in the long term, also benefit the country of origin. Migration is not a one-way street. It's something where mobility is important, and mobility goes in all directions at the same time. What about irregular migration now? It's a specific issue, it's difficult to tackle because it's clandestine. It's against the law to enter the country irregularly. It's against the law to work without the proper permits. It's against the law to employ people without the proper documentation. So it's all in the shadows of the grey economy. Many terms are used. Irregular migrants, illegal alien. The words I use are irregular migrants or migrants in an irregular situation. The reason is that migrating without proper documentation is not a crime. It's not a crime against persons. No one is hurt when you cross the border on foot. Yes, it's a violation of the law. It's an administrative regulation that has not been observed, like not parking in the right place and getting a ticket for it. So it is a violation of the law, but it's not a crime. If I say illegal alien, I necessarily connote and want to connote criminality. I want to portray this person as dangerous, as a menace, a threat to the community. When you have these two elements, the need to go, the unrecognized labor needs that no one wants to talk about, and in between, you have a barrier, a huge barrier, which is the border control policy that's been established. Well, that means that the needs will be filled by people who will come irregularly, who will come by bypassing the border controls and becoming vulnerable and staying in the shadows and being clandestine. And it is because they are clandestine and irregular that they accept the working conditions and the wages. It's their vulnerability that is important in making them into cheap labor for those national employers who produce fruits, who build houses, or who feed us in restaurants. Since irregular migrants have to cross border controls irregularly, the imposition of strict border control policies have created a market for smugglers, smuggling rings. These smugglers have always existed. If you have seen the movie Casablanca with Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, it's about a smuggling operation, getting out of a dictatorship and finding protection in free countries. And if we put in place strict border policies, while knowing very well that people will go across, we create the conditions for a market for smugglers. And the stricter the border policies are, the more entrenched the smuggling rings become, and the more vulnerable the migrants are, because they are totally at the hands of the smugglers. And so we have to recognize, and certainly host states who want to guard their borders with strict border control policies have to acknowledge that their border control policies are part of the problem, not simply of the solution. That those border control policies create the smuggling industry and not simply fight the smuggling industry. Smuggling and trafficking. These are two very different activities, which sometimes are exercised by the same criminal rings. Smuggling is about transporting people from one country to the next while avoiding border control. In many cases, it's like a travel agency. You pay for the passage is organized, you get to the other side of the border, the contract is over. Since it is a place and time where migrants are very vulnerable. Some smugglers and other criminals will prey on them during the smuggling operation, but the smuggling itself is a travel contract. Trafficking is something else entirely. Trafficking is about transporting people for exploiting them. Politicians confuse the two, and in their discourse will confuse the two, because the fight against trafficking is always valid. We need to fight trafficking. Trafficking is an international crime, while smuggling actually may be useful. Smuggling may actually serve a purpose. And politicians don't want to recognize this because this goes against their idea of how to implement strict border control policies. Migrants have all the same human rights as any other person, as any other citizen, except two: the right to vote and be elected, and the right to enter and stay in the country. These two human rights in international human rights law, provided for in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, are reserved for the citizen. All other rights are for everyone. The right, for example, to equality and the right not to be discriminated against. Any distinction between citizens and foreigners that is not justified is a discrimination and is prohibited. The central message here is that we all have the same rights. We all have the same dignity. And we must recognize these rights in order to live a dignified life. We should make sure that migrants have actually access to justice, have access to proper remedies, remedies that will not endanger them, remedies that will not threaten them with arrest, detention, deportation, and that they can fight for their own rights. So my mandate is to be the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. This is a mandate that was given to me by the United Nations Human Rights Council in the summer of 2011. I'm expected to do 2 country visits per year and to report on them, and I'm supposed to do 2 thematic studies per year and report on them. When I do a country visit, I meet with successively, and often it's a complicated organization. I meet with the UN organizations who work in the country. I meet with the authorities who have invited me to come and make a country visit. I always have to be invited by the country. I will meet with NGOs of the country or international NGOs working in the country, and I will meet with migrants themselves. One of the important things I do, testifying on their behalf about their conditions, trying to change the language that is used to portray them. So I bring back to the UN, to the countries, to the NGOs, what I have found. Conclusions and recommendations. Recommendations to the authorities of the country, recommendations to NGOs, recommendations to international organizations or regional organizations. So there are recommendations for many people. In the Universal Periodic Review at the UN, when every country, every 4.5 years, will come to the Human Rights Council and defend their human rights record. Well, all the reports by the Special Rapporteurs are then used and put together in order to create the portrait of the human rights situation in the country. If I have a general objective, a vision, that I would like to see migrants empowered to fight for their own rights. Mobility should be valued for what it brings to society at all levels. And mobility should be encouraged for migrants as well as for citizens.